Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope you're all doing well today. Today we're going to venture to West Virginia for some Sasquatch and what I believe to be Dogman encounter. Before we get into these encounters, though, a couple links I'd like to share. As you know, I rely on my Patreon, my PayPal, and my merch to help this channel to continue to grow and go. Those links are all in the description below. I also have a second channel for creepypasta, fanfiction, and scary voice acting. Stories that really don't fit on this channel. Now, if that's anything that you're into, follow that link and give those stories a listen. You may just like what you hear. I also started a GoFundMe page to help raise some money for December 3rd's decompression surgery I'll be having. If that's anything that you're interested or willing to help with, that would be greatly appreciated. That link is in the description below as well. Now, I've taken enough of your time. Let's get on with these encounters, shall we? Today's first encounter is a possible Dogman encounter. When you hear the details of this encounter and the description, you'll see why I believe it is a Dogman. Also, viewer discretion is advised. When I was a little kid in the early 90s, I lived in Bandy Town in Boone County, West Virginia. And as a kid, I remember being friends with this neighborhood boy who suddenly got snatched up while playing in the woods with his older brother and killed. The older brother claimed while playing he had watched a huge black cat run up and grab his brother by the head or neck and took off with him. When they found the little boy's body, it was torn up pretty bad. From what I heard, his neck was broken and his face was partially eaten. But no one ever really believed the older brother's story about a panther, and officials just chalked it up to being a bear attack. But everyone involved agreed that it didn't look like your typical bear mauling, which was very common where I was from. They never found the animal during the hunt, so parents around the area were definitely a lot more touchy about us playing outside at the time. And no one I knew was allowed to play outside at night anymore because the old folks talked about hearing what sounded like a baby crying or a woman screaming deep down in the mountains behind their homes. But a couple of months after the boy's funeral, things died down a bit. I remember playing in an old empty lot near my home besides this huge mountain. I think I was down on the ground playing with a garter snake or some bug when I heard something that sounded like grunts, which obviously got my attention. I lifted my head up and there's this big and slim black panther-like animal standing up from the tall weeds about 20 to 30 feet away behind a fence that blocked the lot from the mountain. This thing was unlike anything I had ever seen. I can't remember every detail, but its snout was long and chunkier, just like a dog's, not like a cougar or a cheetah, and its tail was very long, and it stayed in this J-like bend the entire time. It watched me for a while, not moving an inch, and never taking its eyes off of me, with its head low to the ground and mouth slightly hung open. But my screaming and hollering scared it away, or it lost interest, because it didn't take long after I started hollering for it to turn around and shoot back into the side of the mountain and out of sight. Still to this day, I'd bet everything I own that what I saw that day was the same thing that grabbed that little boy, because I lived like 10 or 15 houses down from where he lived and was playing at. Today's second encounter. It was decided by the group that we were going to hold a Bigfoot research investigation at a location in West Virginia. After going through all the planning, we set out on this expedition. An interesting note is that there were very little information or background history shared about the location. Being that I was relatively new to the concept of expeditions and researching in other locales, I never questioned this. As time progressed, I did become a little curious about the events that might have caused this location to be chosen for the expedition. I asked what the history was and was met with silence and very little information. We left and heading towards West Virginia. It was a pretty uneventful drive, but the scenery was very beautiful. It became more scenic the closer we got to the Smoky Mountains. We arrived at the host's home and went through the instructions and last-minute preparations before heading to the campsite. It was decided that I was going to ride up to the camp with the host's wife. I didn't find this too outlandish and opted to go with the flow. During the quiet ride to the camp, I got curious and asked her a question that I previously got little information on. What was the history on this place? She began to tell me a few stories that were a little bit unsettling. In the first account, she stated that a couple from out of state had pulled their travel trailer into the campground and had some strange things happen during their short stay. She states the couple heard strange sounds at night, and on occasion would see or hear movement around the trailer at night as well. On their last day, the wife had gotten up early and began cleaning. She was washing dishes at the sink and something frightening happened to her. She was standing there washing dishes and some movement outside the window caught her eye. She looked up and was face to face with a Bigfoot type creature. She became frightened and began to yell. The yelling scared off the creature and woke her husband up. They packed up their camp and left later that morning. The second story that she told me was a bit more concerning than the first. She told me about a high school-aged kid who had gotten into an argument with his parents and decided he was going to run away. He left and no one had any idea where he had gone to. After he left, his parents became very concerned. Due to the concern, they thought he was possibly doing harm to himself. They contacted law enforcement and reported him missing. A search began, and about 2 days later, 2 park rangers happened upon his campsite and vehicle. Upon closer investigation, they found his tent was down. An initial glance looked like he had started breaking down his tent. Everything was there in his campsite except for him. It was later learned that the tent was ripped to shreds and there was blood all over it and his sleeping bag which was inside the tent. She then told me that the search ensued in the forest around the campground. The boy was never found. Shortly after, we arrived to the camp, and darkness was soon to set upon us. We set up our tents and set up a fire pit and got everything in order. After we got everything in order, it was well into darkness and decided it was time to get something to eat. We all gathered around the fire, cooking hot dogs and such. Everyone got done eating, and we gathered back around the fire to discuss the plan for that night. We were sitting there, and I was listening to discussion. As they were talking, I heard a very low snapping sound coming from across the road. I guess I was the only one to hear the sound because everyone kept talking and no one paid attention to the direction the sound was coming from. The sound came again from the same direction, and I stopped whoever was talking to let them know that I had heard something coming from the wooded area across the road. Bob grabbed his spotlight and took off across the road. He turned it on once he had gotten into the high foliage and began to pan the light back and forth. He stopped panning the light and was focused on one area. He whistled, and I was thinking to myself that he must have spotted a deer moving in the tall weeds. Next thing I know, he calls out to us and says that if we wanted to see one, we better come and look. The host of the expedition took off running out of the campsite towards Bob. I decided to stay put in the campsite with Steve. Before the host of the expedition could reach the spot where Bob was standing, the panning of the spotlight panned. I assumed that he couldn't see the creature any longer and was looking for where it had gone to. All of a sudden, I saw something in the ambient light behind the tree. As the spotlight panned closer to this thing, I could make this thing out clearly. It was huge, humanoid silhouette. As the light got closer to it, I watched this thing jump from behind the tree to the side of the tree. I stood there looking at it. and 3 thoughts entered my mind. Those were, it's huge, it's close, and don't do anything to piss it off. Steve was standing at a slightly different angle than me, and when the creature jumped from behind the tree, he could see the light hit its eyes. I didn't know much about Steve, but later on found out that when he was a kid, a Bigfoot creature would visit him at night and peer through his window at him. It terrified him. In an instant, he was taken back to that memory and began to seriously freak out, and I could hear him loudly saying something about the creature. I thought that something was maybe attacking him, and I turned to see what was going on. He began walking in circles in the campsite, rambling on about this creature and that creature. There were some expletives as well. Steve was a big guy, and the level that he was shaken up concerned me a little. I walked over to him and asked if he was okay, and after about 30 minutes of hyperventilating, he seemed to calm down a little bit. Bob and the host came back into the campsite and asked if everything was okay. Shortly thereafter, we found out that when Bob had crossed the road and had gone into the weeds, that he had caught a smaller, younger-looking Bigfoot in his spotlight that was crouched down on the trail that had been worn through the dense foliage. He related that he had whistled to try to get our attention without yelling to scare the creature away. When he whistled, the creature looked at him, looked at the circus that was unfolding in the campsite, and wheeled around and headed back up the trail away from Bob. The conversation that had took place before the Bigfoot came into the area was that the host and Bob talking about driving up and down the roads in the area to see if they could find anything. There wasn't any real clarification as to what Steve and I were going to be doing while they were riding around. I told them that I was going to stay in camp with Steve because of the level of being upset he concerned me. I actually thought he was going to have a heart attack. We waited around camp for a while for it to get later before they left to go for a ride on the roads. While we were waiting, we could hear the owls hooting up the mountainside in the area where the road went. All of a sudden, we heard a loud snap and a crashing sound. We didn't know what it was, but we assumed that it could have been a Bigfoot breaking a tree possibly. The other option was a tree falling over and making that cracking sound. We didn't know what it was. Bob and the host decided to head out around 12. They left Steve and I in camp, and we were just hanging out talking. That's when Steve told me about what happened to him when he was a kid. I had no idea, but understood from what he was telling me and why he reacted the way he did. I felt bad for him and had no idea what it was like to try to cope with something like that. Steve also told me about the amount of health problems that he was having, and that is when I found out that he had to use a portable oxygen machine. He told me that he was going to go sit in his car and put his oxygen on and see if it helped him calm down. He told me I could sit in the passenger seat if I wanted, and I agreed to do so we could talk if he wanted to. We sat there talking and looking at the 2 lanterns hanging from the trees, hoping that nothing came into the campsite while we were there. A short time later, we both passed out. The next thing I remember, I'm waking up to the sound of a vehicle driving into campsite. It was pitch black, as best as I can tell, so I figured Bob and the host had been gone for a long time. Bob pulled into the campsite, and they got out of his truck. I could hear them talking about something, and I could see them looking at the lanterns and saying something about them that I couldn't really make out. I figured the lanterns had run out of fuel, and they were trying to get them relit. They lit the lanterns and got ready to bed down for what was left of the night. I lied my head back and fell asleep again. The next morning, we got up and everyone was going through their own morning routines. I happened to think about them coming back into camp and asked what they were talking about when they came back. Bob told me that when they pulled up into the campsite that it looked like the lanterns had ran out of fuel. He said when they got out of the truck, he went to check on them and found they weren't out of fuel, but had actually been turned down. They figured that we had turned them down before we had gotten into the car. I told him no, that when we had gotten into the car and fell asleep, the lanterns were burning bright and neither of us had turned them down. How the lanterns got turned down was a mystery. The only thing I know for fact was that there were no other campers in the campground, and we had heard no vehicles come in when they were gone. I don't know how they got turned down, and I can't say that a Bigfoot came into camp and did it because I didn't see it for myself. The one thing I'm glad of is that if it was a Bigfoot, that I didn't see it come into camp and do it. Bob and the host said that they didn't find anything on the road other than when they went up the side of the mountain, there was a pretty big-sized pine tree that had broken over and fell into the road to block the way. Bob said this creeped him out. When he got out of the truck to move the tree, he moved it and they went on their way. That morning, after we talked about the lantern, the host said that he had to go back to his house and get his car to leave. He tried to start his vehicle, but for some reason it didn't start. Bob offered to drive him back, and they asked me if I minded keeping an eye on the camp. Steve was going to follow them to the main road and begin his trip back to Indiana. I felt good and had no inkling of reservation about staying in the camp by myself. I was armed and it was daytime. What could possibly go wrong? I had no idea that this day would be the one that was etched into my mind forever. Not just that, it formed a lot of my research quirks that I have today. There are things that I do and things that I don't do because of that day. I agreed to stay at camp and get things in order for Roger's arrival later that day. They got their stuff together and left. Alright guys, so tomorrow we're going to finish the last couple of bits of this journal of these Bigfoot researchers that are out in West Virginia. I really want to know what your guys' opinions are of the first encounter. Everything that is listed or talked about in that first encounter tells me Dogman. I don't know too many large mountain cats that have a dog-like muzzle. Panthers and some mountain lions are very strong enough to drag a child, through the woods. But everything was pointing, even the experts were saying that it was a bear attack, but it didn't look like a bear attack. Just everything points to a Dogman encounter for me. I might be wrong. I'm no expert. I never claimed to be an expert. I just want to know what you guys think. I know there's quite a bit of you guys that are from West Virginia, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys say. The reason why I'm not going to finish the next 8 pages of this journal is I'm not really feeling good. My eyes are kind of burning and I've got a headache. I wanted to get this out to you guys, so tomorrow I'll do the part 2 of it, and that way you guys will have the whole encounter the whole research project that happened. Anyway, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed these encounters as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. Like I always say, I want to bid you guys farewell, but I also want to say thank you, and may the Great Spirit watch over all of you.